So this evening, if we could invite Dr. Ho Chong-shi to share with us a bit about the Composers Society of Singapore and its role with the Composing Monumentality project.
Yeah, tonight is the last night of this series of sharing, yeah, and also showing the end results of our research. Actually, Jun Kai approached me some time back, and we discussed this project, and I thought it was a very good idea, simply because one of our main mission of the society is of course to document new music happenings in Singapore. And I think that those of you who have been following our social media, like Facebook, Instagram, etc., you will notice that we are really building up online presence in a way, really holding lots of information about very current activities, new music activities in Singapore. So at the same time, I think we should not forget about some of the composers from the pioneering generations. And so earlier, Ms. Goh actually helped us in securing some works that were commissioned by SYO during her tenure as a conductor there. And I think that sparked interest in earlier composers from the earlier generation. And so later on, when Jin Kai approached me, I thought that, oh, this would be a good follow-up to that initiative. And so in a way, our society is looking at what's current as well. So trying to build a narrative on the development of new music in Singapore. I think that has not been well covered in a way. At the very least, we also hope to generate some interest of those pioneering composers among the younger generation composers. And therefore, it is very encouraging to see so many young composers taking part in this research. Yeah, so thanks a lot, Jun Kai, for that brilliant idea, and thanks to everyone for your interest to show up for this sharing session. All right, so back over to you, Jun Kai.
Right, thank you very much. So we are very happy and honored to collaborate with the Composer Society of Singapore for this project. So without further ado, I'll introduce panel. Our first, it's Leah first. Apologize. Right, let the train pass and then I can start. Okay, so this evening we have two speakers, Leah and panel. Let me introduce Leah. Leah is undertaking a master's in musicology at the University of Oxford under the Ertegun Scholarship. This year, she is working on post-humanism in music, Indian classical dance, and language ideology in Singaporean state music. And for our second speaker, Kenneth TAY is a choral music practitioner and divides his time between composing, conducting, singing, teaching, research, music production, and recording. A very long list. He received his Masters of Music with distinction at the University of Aberdeen, specializing in composition, choral, and choral music. So I'll let Leah start with talking about the choral music of Leong Yoon Pin. Over to you, Leah.
Hi, everyone. No, thanks for the introduction, Jun, and thank you to Chang-Shi for introducing Composer Society as well, and all the great work that you all do. So I was actually really happy to be part of this project from September to February, because it allowed me to kind of ground my music research back in Singapore after not really doing that in my undergrad and at the start of my master's as well. And I found it really illuminating to go into Leong Yoon Pin's work and to see works that I had never discovered before, and I didn't think were really part of school syllabi, and that we just didn't have a chance to know because they come out of fashion these days. And so I just want to share a bit of that and what I found very striking with all of you. And I'll do that in a short presentation, which I have on slides in a second. Yes, okay. All right, so today's presentation will be about Leong Yoon Pin's anti-monumental delicious music. I know, a very interesting selection of words put together, but I promise they'll make sense by the end of this presentation. So yeah, and this picture that you see is actually my modification of the first page of Leong Yoon Pin's Street Calls, which is about hawkers plying their trade at the side of the road and calling out the names of their dishes. And as you'll see later, I've worked a little bit on this piece with a visual score interpretation, and that's why I put it here. But I put this as a preface just to say that Leong Yoon Pin's music is very multisensory, and he tends to engage a lot with food, especially local food that we might know of, and not just local food in its being eaten, but in the labor of making it and selling it as well. And in doing so, he puts Singaporean lives and livelihoods at the center of a lot of his works. And that's the strand that I'll be focusing on today. But first, a little bit about Leong Yoon Pin. There was already another presentation about him, so I won't go too much into his life per se, but just to highlight that he lived in 1931 to 2011, so going through a lot of major historical developments and milestones in Singapore history, as well as his own life history, and those tended to collide in various places. So he did live through the Japanese occupation and merger, independence, etc. And throughout this time, he was pursuing his own education in the UK, in Paris, under Nadia Boulanger, and as well as back to the UK. So he went to study at Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and then later at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in music education. And so he wore many hats during his career as a composer, conductor, educator, and general pioneer of music and ensembles in Singapore. And for more comprehensive timeline and milestones, you can go to the website I've put here, Explained Offstage. It's really informative and helpful. Yeah, and now, yes, and going into this project as well, of course, it's called Composing Monumentality. And I had a bit of a think about what I wanted that to mean, or what that currently means in today's day and age, which is decidedly more skeptical about the idea of monuments and monumentality. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the figure on the right. It's kind of hard to escape it really when you're in that area. And on the left, I feel like this is also quite common knowledge. You probably know from the whole iconography who this is, even though it's quite extreme to have an angel holding a wreath to Beethoven. There he is. So just to talk a little bit about this concept and what it means in my research and what I've interpreted it to mean in Leong Yoon Pin's work is, let's start with monuments in the first place. So monuments commemorate and preserve an element, person, object for future people. And in doing so, it shapes historical consciousness, and in itself embodies an awareness of the passage of time and how only selective things will get remembered and curated in very selective ways by people of authority. And so monuments themselves claim moral authority in public space, like this one. But a kind of valence to this I found very interesting was in Adorno's work, in which he said monuments are museal, in that they are no longer in vital relationship with the observer, but in the process of dying. And that's why they have to be monumentalized in the first place. So in themselves, they kind of show an awareness of the ephemerality of whatever it is that's being commemorated, or the fact that it's going to pass into the past. And just thinking about what that might mean in music, people like Karl Dahlhaus, for example, have said that monumentality in music is associated with stylistic properties and formal demands to do with force, largely. So if you think about monumentality, you might think of grand effects, big forms, heroic themes, the cannons in the symphony, for example, like Mahler's hammer, also all that kind of thing. And it's no surprise, really, that monumental music of that sort has been co-opted by political regimes of the day. Like 1812 was played in America's July the 4th celebrations with nothing to do with 1812's original context, and similarly with Ride of the Valkyries being played by the American military. And so that's just kind of interesting to think about, in that music can also claim that moral authority that statues and physical monuments claim, but with a bit more elasticity because they don't have that same representational quality. And so Alexander Redding in Music and Monumentality says that we've passed into a more anti-monumental age in the 20th century, although I think the time markers are not very accurate for different parts of the world. Of course, he's talking about the West and after World War II. But in general, I feel that if you're following the news, we'll probably have seen a more rejection of the heaviness and permanence of certain monuments, and in favor of celebrations that are less easy to appropriate ideologically. So I think this kind of resonates with my own approach to music and composers, and I try to think of an anti-monumental approach to Leong Yoon Pin's music, and I do think that I found things that really resonated with this idea of monumentality, but more as a verb. So to elevate, to preserve, to honor, and to appraise certain things, but not necessarily to make them into towering monuments, even though, of course, Leong Yoon Pin has his own grand forms like symphonies and opera even. But what really struck me in his work was actually a more humanist impulse to make mundane things significant, to make the small things important and the sonic things musical, and the things that are going to pass with time kind of relivable in artistic performance again. So I've just put in here 3 excerpts from scores of his pieces, and you can recognize sort of the settings are very much rooted in daily, mundane, sort of unglamorous parts of life, or not necessarily glamorous parts of life. So in the first piece, the choir is singing, you know, dong qiang, dong qiang, dong qiang, trying to emulate the sound of the dragon dance as it passes you by in a HGV block or anything. And in the second one is in Street Calls, which is the piece I'm going to be focusing on a bit more later, in which the choir is, as mentioned earlier, portraying the street vendors and how they're selling their various foods, hakao siu mai, etc. And in the third excerpt, it's Karangoni, Karangoni, embodying the Karangoni people who collect your cardboard, you know. So he does in this sense, and also using living singers to then embody this. There's an element of empathy and empathizing and trying to elevate these very mundane daily scenes into a form of art, and to say that they're actually, that labor is valuable and it's aesthetically fruitful. Yeah, and it deserves to be appreciated and made time for. So, and when I think about to monumentalize in my own work as a researcher, then it's to be able to celebrate the composer's significance without also then turning him into a monument, like in attaching the Western art music's rhetoric of solitary male genius and master, but also putting him in a context aside always contemporaries, and taking into account how he got into positions where he could be so influential in Singaporean music in general. But I won't be going through this right now because I'll focus more on his piece Street Calls and his aesthetics within that. So let's now go on to, yes, foodscapes and street calls. So we're back at this picture. And I just want to talk a bit about how this particular piece is trying to put street hawkers at the focus, and the whole thing is calling out various dishes that many people might be familiar with, like chicken porridge, like dumpling noodle and char siu fan, that kind of thing. But the thing is that I think we as a Singaporean audience might take the knowledge of these food for granted, and maybe to us it conjures a kind of multi-sensory experience of taste, smell, like affect, being sitting in a hawker center with your family, or sitting, you know, having this food at home even. And when the work travels internationally, I wonder if this really changes the experience, and whether this then becomes once again just a sonic experience where the words sound like expressive, but ultimately they don't come attached with any kind of other sensory experience that it actually embodies and that inspired its conception. So, And so when I thought about how I could respond to this piece, I wanted to actually reinsert the gustatory element of street calls into it. And I decided to come up with a visual translation of this score. And it's intended to be a playful reinterpretation rather than a faithful remapping of the score in pictorial terms. And it can even be taken as a derivative kind of artwork in another domain, although I hope that I kind of hope that it's not evaluated in that respect, but I see it more of as a translation and maybe even an aid to analysis. So right now I will show you my score and Leong Yoon Pin's score in tandem while also playing the piece. And then I'll talk a bit about the creation of the score. And I really welcome your thoughts because, yeah, I went out on a limb here, but Jing was very nice and told me that, yeah, the score was welcome. So I'm here to share it with you now. Now I'm going to attempt to stop my share. Yes, and then just configure the music and the new score and then share my screen again. Yes, okay. Okay, I hope you all can see this and hear this. I'm going to start playing it and going through the score. Wait, I'm so sorry. Could you see the score or was it just focused on the video? Okay, let me try and fix that. Just a quick second. Okay, hold on. Let me share on the score directly first. Okay, and then let me try and play the music and you can let me know if you can hear the music. Ooh, sorry, it's not it. And see the score.
Yes.
Okay, so I hope you enjoy that. I found that a little bit entertaining. So I had thoughts about the score as well and how successful it was. Because I had the idea and then I kind of worked on it in a delirium and then eventually looked back at the whole thing and realized the irony at how even though I intended to maybe increase someone's appetite, it tended to look quite grotesque a lot of the time, especially when you see like these elongated photos of the food. But I also feel that that was, well, it was quite funny to me because it also increased the sensory experience in general of the piece. And so I quite enjoyed the process of creating it and then looking back at it as well. And I hope that, and I feel that even though, for example, certain things worked better than others in the score, and it helps you see and perceive certain things at the expense of others. So for example, you can't see any of the melodic or harmonic kinds of developments and structures in that visual score, but it actually helps you take a step back and see very clearly how the composers group certain foods together, how they're being passed around, as it were. I see the emoji that you're reacting with, Changshi, that's very funny. Yeah, and how the food's being passed around, how certain sections tend to be dominated by certain foods and certain pairings as well. And also the textural interplay gets translated into a very interesting interplay visually. And you can see how things like diminution and expansion are reflected as well. So I kind of envision this more as an aid to analysis, or even pointing towards a more immersive experience of pieces like this. So for example, we can imagine that what if the piece is actually experienced in a context where people get to eat and to drink and to fully immerse themselves in what they're hearing. Or also if even the piece is taken in a more open-ended fashion and the development of the piece depends on the actual popularity of the dishes that are being sung about. So that there's endless kind of variations, and Leong Yoon Pin has a few pieces like this. And so I think it's just kind of, it opens the door to a more playful orientation towards them. Yes, and so I enjoyed creating this, and I hope that, yeah, you had some fun listening to it as well. And I think with that, I will end my presentation. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. That is very delicious indeed. We shall move on to another composition by Tien to be introduced by Kenneth TAY.
Right, thank you, Jun Kai. Thank you just now for the very wonderful introduction of me. So you might see me wear different hats, not just as a composer, conductor, singer, blah, 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 but also, you know, in many places around Singapore, because I am a singer and I do sing in many choirs, many different ensembles. So interestingly, when Leia decided to pick up the topic on Leong Yoon Pin's choral music first, I was a little sad. But anyway, yes, here going to talk about another composer that's also very significant in the landscape of Singapore in particular, and it's going to be Mr. Leong Yoon Pin. Okay, I will just put up the screen share so you can follow along. Here we are. Dun, 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 dun. Also, I'm a singer, so I do sometimes break into song very, very suddenly, so don't mind me. All right. Okay, so a little bit first about Mr. Tien, just so that we can lay the ground as to who he is and what makes him this particular monumental figure of Singaporean music. Okay, so first things first, Tien, he was born in 1952 to a humble family. So his father was a signboard painter, and his formative years were spent under a period of many changes in Singapore's history. So you would probably know a little bit of your history about some racial riots that happened in the late 50s. You also know of independence of Singapore in 1965. So this was a time of lots of changes as well, and Mr. Phoon was growing up in that period in Singapore's history. People often describe Mr. Phoon's music as straddling between two worlds, between the East and West, between specifically Chinese orchestral music and Western concert music. And it's this straddling that people often associate as that particular bridge between the East and the West. Now, I've had the joy of meeting Mr. Phoon to sit down with him over some tea. He was very kind and he hosted me to some tea at his place. But this is what he had to say about this musical language. So he was saying, and I quote him, this is what he said: "I think Western music theory and harmonies don't fit wholly into Chinese orchestral music in those days." That is in the 1970s and the 1980s when he was starting to compose. And you often have to think of a way to go around it. It made you think how to make use of what you learn in Western music theory. And I think also in Singapore, we are one of the pioneers of using Western concepts of music and merging them into Chinese orchestral music. Now, that's what Mr. Phoon had to say and had to share with me. Okay. Some other things about Mr. Phoon Tien. He first learned the dizi, Chinese flute, and so this was between 1968 and 1979. He was aged about 16 to about 27. He played with a number of ensembles around Singapore, including the National Theatre Chinese Orchestra, the Singapore Youth Chinese Orchestra, and of course the Singapore Chinese Orchestra. And again, I had asked him a bit about this particular incident where he actually represented Singapore at the International Festival of Youth Orchestras in Switzerland. And in my interview with him, he says with a lot of lucidity and lots of enthusiasm, he says this, and I quote, "My background is different because I was Chinese educated and I was self-taught in Chinese instruments. So even though I first joined the PA Chinese Orchestra, which was supposed to be professional, all of us were actually self-taught. We listened to Chinese music, of course, but learned a lot about Western music after our tour to Switzerland. That was an important tour for us because we got to listen to so many Western symphonic orchestra performances every night. When we came back to Singapore, we wanted to learn more, so we took Western instrumental lessons, theory lessons, and all that. We are different from mainland Chinese composers because they were professionally trained early on. They have a better background in a way. So therefore, Chinese music written by a Singaporean composer like myself and a mainland Chinese one is very different, especially when we try to talk about Nanyang style. And following this particular trip to Switzerland, Mr. Phoon Tien became a student of Mr. Leong Yoon Pin, whom two of my colleagues, Leia and of course Kuang, on Monday, have conducted their research and presented their research over this composing Monumentality series. Okay. Thereafter, Mr. Phoon later won a scholarship with the Singapore Symphony Orchestra in 1980. He was 28 years old, and he left to study the flute at Queensland Conservatorium of Music in Australia. He later added a second study in composition, and he won, in particular, composition prize, the Darcy Robertson Prize in Composition 3 times while he was based in Australia. So very accomplished even as a student composer. Okay. So some of his landmark achievements include winning the 1984 Yoshiro Irino Memorial Prize, which he tells me he won 6 years before the Chinese composer Tan. And he wrote this piece titled Author. Right. He also collaborated in 1988 with Go Lei Kwan for this particular dance drama, Nü Wa. Okay. And it was actually featured as the flagship performance in the 1988 Singapore Arts Festival. Okay. Other achievements, I think Mr. Phoon Tien is actually no stranger to media, having written for TCS TV dramas like Ah Gong Rou Gu Cha, Grandpa's Meat Bone Tea, and this was a TCS drama in 1997. Next, I think one of his most interesting works as a composer is this one, 乐队变奏曲, which is roughly translated as a novice guide to the Chinese orchestra. Now, Mr. Phoon's work matched the ambition of introducing sounds and instruments to audiences, kind of like how the British composer Benjamin Britten did. So for most music students, they have studied or listened to this work by Benjamin Britten, which features all sounds of the Western orchestra. And what Mr. Phoon Tien did here was to feature sounds of the Chinese orchestra, to encourage young people to give the Chinese instruments a chance, an opportunity for them to see what they sound like, and so that they can write music for Chinese orchestra. Okay. Some of his other recent things and achievements At this point, Mr. Phoon might be Singapore's most recorded composer and also the most listened to, because he rearranged our national anthem in the key of F major. And in fact, it's this arrangement that we hear on TV at 6 a.m. in the morning. It's by Mr. Phoon, and it's been around since the year 2001. Okay, so for more than 20 years. Now, you might ask me, Kenneth, what does it mean for music to be monumental? Because over the course of the last 3 days, each of us have taken monumentality to mean very different things. For me, I would borrow this understanding from this musicologist, American musicologist, Alexander Redding, who in his work actually explores the connection between big sounds, ambitions of greatness specific to Germany in the 19th century. But I think his definition and his understanding could be pretty useful for us to understand Mr. Phoon's music as well. So briefly, and in summary of what you see over here, a monument is something like a statue. It means something. It invokes memories. It carries some kind of message that speaks to people. Now, of course, in the 19th century, there were composers that really wanted to write music that was absolute. In a way, music that had no meaning. So the music was a vehicle in itself. When you listen to a piece of music, then you shouldn't make associations with other kinds of things. Yeah, but monumentality, or monumental music in particular, has some kind of representational effect. It carries a certain kind of message that's understood by people, and it speaks to people. Right, and in particular, I will introduce one particular segment in Mr. Phoon's music that represents that monumentality to me. Okay, but first, the work that I focus on is actually the secular cantata titled Confucius. This was performed in 2001 at the Singapore Arts Festival. Okay, let me just list out some reasons why this work is really monumental. Okay, first, okay, and I think perhaps most striking is the large number of performers required at its premiere. So Mr. Phoon was also very kind to me, and he gave me a copy of the CD, a CD recording of this particular work. And you can also find a copy of the CD in our library as well, the National Library. But based on the program that I saw in this included CD, I counted a total of 64 orchestra members. So the Chinese orchestra players, you might see some familiar names here on this particular slide. I also counted 103 choristers, and the choir members were made up of singers from 3 different choirs. There were 8 soloists in total, and then there was, of course, the conductor for all the premiere, Professor Xia Feiyun, and also the chorus master, Mr. Nelson Kui. Okay. Now, a second reason why this was such a big thing, monumental composition, if we could refer to it as such, is that there was a lot of visibility. There's a high level of direct support by the state, and in particular through the National Arts Council. From what I understand, this was actually the biggest ever fee that was paid to a composer for any sort of a musical commission, right? And at the premiere, there were many high-level audiences that attended, which included then Deputy Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. There was also Ambassador at Large Tommy Koh, and Mr. Lee Seng-Yi, who was the chairman of the Lee Foundation at that point of time. So you had all these very, very fabled people and audiences attending the premiere. Okay. Third, and I think also very pertinent to how important this work is as a monument, is that it is 10 movements long. Okay, so when you think of a monumental music, perhaps in 19th century Germany, you might think of, say, Mahler symphonies or something like that. But I think this particular composition dwarfs anything out of Germany in the 19th century. The total playtime of Confucius, the secular cantata, is 2 hours and 27 minutes. And from my knowledge, and I've also checked with Mr. Phoon, this is by far the longest continuous work written by any Singapore composer for the concert music medium. Okay. I think the closest thing that he said was probably long, like more than an hour long, by a Singaporean composer, was actually a work by his teacher, Mr. Leong Yoon Pin, and opera. Okay. Another point about monumentality was that Mr. Phoon was actually a composer that worked in a time before computers. So he actually laboriously hand engraved all 490 pages of his orchestra score. And you see here on the left side of the screen a particular scan of one of the pages of his cantata. Okay. Very neatly engraved, and I think very interesting document to look at. So I did manage to borrow a copy from the library at the Yong Conservatory of Music in NUS. Okay, I actually had a chat with him about it, and I asked him if he had faced any challenges, given the size of this work. So let me quote him in my conversation. Here's what Mr. Phoon had to say. He said this, that there was a lot for me to do to come up with the full orchestra score as well as the piano short score for the choir and the soloists. So that took up a lot of time. I only knew I had to do all that towards the end, just as I was finishing the orchestra score. So it was a huge blow to me. It was a huge shock because I was just trying to finish and meet the deadline. In fact, the reason I eventually turned to the computer was because of this piece, the Confucius secular cantata, because sitting down at his desk really hurt my back. So imagine you compose such a long work, and I think in less than half a year. So it was quite a challenge. So that's what Mr. Phoon had to say. All right. Next, I will discuss a segment used in this work, the Confucius secular cantata. This is the part of the performance where both the orchestra and the choir perform, right? And it's based on libretto, this set of texts, Tien, Tao, Tao. In fact, this particular fragment is used 3 times throughout the composition, and later on you'll hear a recording of this. I think this segment is quite representative of monumentality because it represents something. It speaks to people living in very difficult times. So let me just introduce this text here in this extract. So it goes like this: 天下滔滔，净土难找，什么时候百姓才免受煎熬？这世上哪里去觅大道？ And so my own translation of the text would go something like this. Okay, so the world is unstable and promised lands are hard to find. Okay. When will ordinary people be free from suffering? In this world, where do we find a way? Right, so there's some kind of a deliberation going on. We all live in a very, very tricky time in our history as well, with the ongoing pandemic. In fact, I had caught COVID also, and it was pretty miserable when I was locked up at home. I lost my sense of taste, and yeah, my own connection with the outside world while I was in isolation was kind of taken away from me because I couldn't taste anything I ate, and I was stuck indoors. Right. So next, I will just briefly provide an idea of what's going on in this particular extract, the musical ideas, and perhaps a breakdown of the melody and how Mr. Phoon used harmony as well. Okay, so the composer actually uses minor pentatonic scales like la, do, re, mi, so, la, so, mi, re, do, la, and he uses this pentatonic scale as a key building block to build the melody in this particular segment. And I think the pentatonic scale does convey that sense of nobility as well as the sublime. So in this slide, I have summarized and notated the melody in solfege. So if you're a music student, perhaps you might find this pretty interesting or easy to follow. So the key in which the melodic line seems to suggest is actually notated in red above the note. So from the beginning, we have a G minor, mi, re, do, la, do, re, mi. Then we have a quick shift modal modulation. La, do, re, mi, re, do, la, do, re, mi, do, la, sol, la, do, re, la, sol, la, do, ti, la, and like an E harmonic minor towards the end of the second line. Okay. I think the second line where he transits and breaks away from the pentatonic scale is kind of a nod to his own Western style understanding of a harmonic minor, because the harmonic minor often conveys something tragic and very sad. And you might also notice that this is the part where there are the words 煎熬 in Chinese, which not only has this meaning of suffering, but also torment. right? So that's probably why he decided to borrow and switch to the minor key over here, right? And the rest of the extract is in the B minor pentatonic and of course the F sharp minor pentatonic. Okay. Next, I will just take a quick look at the harmonies that Mr. Phoon uses in this particular extract, in this particular segment of the piece, which I also find particularly interesting. Melody can convey some idea of a tonality, but also if we look at how he chose to harmonize the melody, that might also give us some clues as to how he wanted to paint, to tell a certain story through his music. All right, so over here you can see that he begins in the key of G natural minor, and in the second system in particular through about 2 bars of pivot chords, and then you see like F sharp note, an F sharp note that's used in the bass in bar 5 over here, and then that helps ground a piece and leads it to its new modulation to the key of E natural minor that I talked about earlier on. You also notice that I used and I marked chords in a slightly different way from how you might understand Western music theory. Okay, both in green with letter Qs. Okay, I call these a quartal, which is a chord which is built by stacking perfect fourths intervals. These are a little bit different from what we might learn in Western music theory, where lots of chords are actually built on triads like do, mi, so, or re, fa, la, or something of like that. So the spacing between each of the notes in a chord typically are in thirds. But a quartal actually uses a series of stacked perfect fourths. I think this gives the sound something different, almost a Asiatic reference, something underlying that tells us that this piece is not really meant to be heard with pure Western ears or a particular training or inclination towards Western music theory. Okay, so on this slide, I show you a difference between a triad and a quartal. So a triad built on D, so D, F, A on the treble clef, and a quartal built on D on the treble clef, D, G, C, right? I hope you get an opportunity to hear how the effect of the quarter sounds later on. Okay, but here we have another quartal built on E, E, G, B, and now a quartal built on E, E, A, D. Okay, so the difference is in the spacing. I find that quartals have this particular unresolved quality. They convey some kind of tension, some kind of pull, some kind of gravity, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. All right. In fact, he uses quartals not only in the beginning of this particular extract, but also later on. You will hear that also on the word na. Okay, like nali, where do we go? So I think it seems to suggest some kind of word painting, even that there's this world where people are struggling to find a way out, struggling to find answers. And yet this quartal in the way he uses it seems to provide something very unresolved to our ears, something very unsettled. And perhaps that's what he's trying to feel as well. All right. Okay, so I think it's time for us to do a little bit of listening. So the extract will be played, and I've managed to get some friends from the basement bunch to sing this extract for us. All right, so I do encourage you to take a listen to it and perhaps to follow along on the melody, how he uses the pentatonic, and perhaps that little surprise flip to a Western style harmonic minor. All right, so without further ado, let's listen to this. Okay. All right. So anyway, as I come towards the end of this presentation, I just want to recap some areas of monumentalism in this particular extract that Phoon Tien presents in the cantata. Okay, first, there's this particular preponderant melody that's built on the pentatonic scale, and it really, I think, conveys this idea of the sublime, right? He also uses triadic and quartal harmony as well, as I've described, in a way as a metaphor for this unstable world. And of course, he's very, very capable, and I think in his text setting and how he uses modulation to express, the meaning of the text, rocky circumstances. All right, and just as I come towards the final slide of today, I would like to highlight, of course, that Mr. Phoon still maintains a very active blog. He writes very regularly in Chinese on his own past performances, his life, and many other musings. He also regularly posts recording links of his own music on his blog, and I do recommend for you to just check it out too on your own time. He does write with a lot of lucidity and really with lots of deep reflection on his work as a composer. All right, with that, thank you very much for listening to my presentation this evening.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, and thank you very much, Leia. That's excellent, very insightful details both of you have reviewed through the scores as well as the performance practices or the performance history and reception. So perhaps I'll start off with the first question, which is, we know that monumentality tends to be something very expressive. When you look at these two pieces of music, your respective pieces of music, the choral pieces as well as the cantata, do you find any introspective aspects via the text or via the musical aesthetics that is monumentally introspective?
By introspective, you mean like in terms of how it's some kind of a self-investigation?
Very philosophical, for instance.
Something philosophical. Mm-hmm. Right.
Very sociological to Singaporean society, reflection on life during the 1990s, perhaps.
Okay, perhaps I'll start first, all right? Leia can have a little bit of time to think. But anyway, so I had a chat with Mr. Phoon, and he actually said that the work, the cantata, was actually not exactly born out of his entire self. It was actually a collaboration with the librettist Zhuang Yongkang, Chong Ying Ho, and in fact it was Zhuang Yongkang that first approached Mr. Phoon with the text. Right, so the entire cantata, the libretto is actually about the teachings of Li Bai, okay, the poet, the Chinese poet Li Bai, and so it was really an opportunity for Mr. Phoon to detail the life of Li Bai, some of his own teachings as well, and to communicate that in a particular society that was, I think he saw as a rather confusion in terms of values. So it's in a way. An opportunity through the music and also through the text to emphasize some of the values that perhaps we hold to in Singapore, things like filial piety, to take care of your parents. And I think for the audiences in the premiere, I think they would have access to a libretto as well, like in their program. So they would have been able to follow the text, the translation as well during the premiere. Right, so it's also an opportunity for, I suppose, for parents to bring their kids to musical performances so that they can learn about, in a way, the morals and things about what makes a good person and how we should treat one another. So I think that would be some aspect of monumentality that would be, in a way, introspective, okay, for Mr. Phoon, as well as for the people that would have attended the premiere. I wonder if that might answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. For Leong Yoon Pin's works, so he always had this view that he was plugging a gap in the choral scene at the time, which tended to focus on European and also Chinese composers' works, but not so much Singaporean works. So I would say that he sort of like really plugged this gap in a few ways. One is by physically founding choirs that would sing Singaporean music, and then by also putting very characteristically local soundscapes into the voices of those people themselves. So they weren't like singing folk songs from other places, but songs that he believed were drawn from what we are singing, what we are hearing, and music that was actively a part of life in Singapore. And so he drew from folk songs which he thought were current at the time, like Dayang Sampan, Linggang Kangkong, and he infused that into his choral music and his work. And it's also interesting to note that in Street Calls, that was a song that's written in Cantonese as well. And he takes care, and that's his own dialect, and he takes care to sort of make sure that the way that he sets the music is in line with the tones of the language. And so it's not a kind of clumsy translation of language and music, but rather it's quite faithful, and it does try to retain that sort of local flavor and identity of the language that is grounded and to the place and to the people. But also I came across a piece of scholarship about Street Calls that said that the sheer dissonance of Street Calls points towards a kind of irony about the past as well. So if you listen to it on one level, you can hear that, oh yeah, this is quite a straightforward evocation and maybe like a literal translation of what it might have been like to hear hawkers and just musicalized. But at the same time, there's a sense of a jarring kind of juxtaposition of classical music or choral music, which was a lineage from the colonial legacy and the colonial history, and something that a lot of people would see as a very disparate register. And so the music does embody that tension. And there's one piece in particular that owns that tension. You know, it doesn't try to shy away from it, and it's called Peddlers and the Soprano. And it's where he has a soprano and singing and vocalizing, basically, not really singing words, over the sounds of, once again, hawkers, which he's quite preoccupied with. And the soprano is almost drowned out by those hawkers trying to sell their otak-otak and their nasi lemak. And so you kind of see these two registers in tension. And I think that it's quite humorous and also self-ironic about the ways in which maybe these two things don't fit together, but he's trying to reconcile them in his work. And maybe they're perceived not fit together, but actually they're quite much more similar than you might think, or they belong in the same plane, all as the sounds that we might hear growing up in Singapore. So I found that, yeah, quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. So we can see there are certain social political links with the music and the text that these composers have utilized. Are there any questions from our audiences this evening for our two speakers?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I'm so sorry I could only join Kenneth's presentation because I had something earlier on. So I wish I could have a chance to hear Leia's talk sometime, like maybe when it's posted or something. Yeah, I have a question for Kenneth. I'm wondering if there are any parts in the Chinese music orchestration that is particularly representative of Phoon Tien's own style, or anyone that strikes you as fascinating in any way. Thank you.
Specific to Phoon Tien's use of the Chinese orchestra, is it?
Yeah, I'm just very curious because I heard this work many years ago in completion, but not live, like as a recording. So I just wondering like what you thought like was special about it.
Okay. For me, I think Mr. Phoon was also quite aware that the Chinese orchestra was still a very young organism, in that there was not actually a lot of repertoire written for the Chinese orchestra, even up at the point that the cantata was performed in 2001. Right. So for me, I think one of the most striking things in the orchestration, or at least how he used the Chinese orchestra, was also his use of percussion in a way to drive a momentum. What you might not have managed to hear in Tien Tao Tao from today was actually in the original recording. He would have used the 大鼓 and the 锣鼓 to do the kind of sound in a way to drive the momentum, right? So in a way, he uses the percussion ensemble, I think, in a very, very unique way, in a way to support the momentum, to give it some drive. And I think also he recognizes it's a practical concert because the piece is very long, at over 2 hours long. So in a way, having the percussion ensemble to have all these little roles really just help to keep the piece going along. Right, that's just my personal view. I'm not sure how you felt when you listened to any of Mr. Phoon's music.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you. Like the whole piece is very exciting because largely because of the percussion. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Another question from the floor.
Can I ask Kenneth?
Yes, Miss Vivian.
If these quartals that you may, hi Kenneth, are these quartals you mentioned are something that you figure out yourself, or is it, do you think Mr. Phoon, what would Mr. Phoon think of that?
Yeah, I don't know what Mr. Phoon would think about that because I've never actually asked Mr. Phoon about the idea of quartals. In fact, the first person to introduce me to this concept of quartals is one of his students, Wu Cai, Dr. Zachariah Goh. So, yeah, so he, yeah, very interestingly, I think he did, when I was taking some classes with Dr. Goh, he also introduced this idea of how, you know, the East has a very, very different sound when it comes to the use of harmonies. Because after all, if you take a pentatonic scale, la, do, re, mi, so, like, how are you going to construct a bunch of do, mi, so chords, right? Like, wouldn't have lots of meaning. So one way to present it might be just to stack fourths, because by stacking a series of fourths, you could actually get all the notes of a pentatonic scale in a way. Yeah, so I don't know what Mr. Phoon thinks. Yeah, I don't know what Mr. Phoon thinks. Yeah,
I'll ask him next time I see him.
Or that's what he might have intended. Because in Western harmony, or at least listening to parts of the cantata with purely a Western ear, there's some things that don't entirely make sense. Yeah.
Well, we remember my discussion with Kenneth was that I was arguing that these quarter notes were auxiliary and passing notes. So that's what I learned from Mr. Phoon himself.
Yeah.
That these were embellishments more than primary harmonies for him. So these are different takes from different students.
Yeah.
So I was quite thinking of that myself as well. But I this quartal thing is quite interesting, Kenneth.
Yes. Perhaps it will give you a different way to listen to music from this part of the world too. Because as a composer, I use quartals, quintals even quite regularly.
Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
Yes. So Chen Jing has typed her comments in the chat. So we have accumulated all of the materials from our researchers on the Composer Society's website, and I have just shared the link with all of you. And you please feel free to share the materials and link with all your colleagues, friends, and associates who might be interested. And if you missed Monday's talk in Mandarin in Chinese, the translated material are also available in English on the website itself. Is there any questions? Last question for this evening. Okay, yes, Leia.
Just a quick one. What's next for this project, do you think? Since you've taken it till here, what do you think is going to happen now?
Oh yes, so the idea is for myself to look at all or some of these works and intercross all your analysis onto one or the other works, which means if we are looking at quarter harmonies in Phoon Tien, I'll be looking at quarter harmonies in Bernard Tan or in Chao Jies, for example. So some of us will be able to see the similarities, analytical similarities, say with how Angela has looked at the harmonies of Bernard Tan's Concerto, and this could be a framework to look at music by other composers of the same pioneering period, pioneering generation. Yes, so that's the first step. And the second step would be that some of the music teachers here in Singapore, some of the MEP music teachers have expressed interest in teaching some of this music, including some of this music in their curriculum for the secondary school and A-level syllabus, or even the IB syllabus. So the more analysis that we are able to produce and churn out, it will generate more education pedagogical materials for the MOE teachers and curriculum. Yeah, so we'll take a step-by-step approach to increasing knowledge and education of these composers, pioneer composers. Thank you very much for your question, Leia. Yes, so we'll wrap up this series of seminars. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the past 3 days, and most importantly, to thank the National Arts Council for sponsoring and supporting this research project, and the EXCO of the Composers Society of Singapore for hosting us for the past three evenings, as well as on their website. And finally, the 6 researchers, including myself, for working very hard over the past 6 months through challenges of getting COVID themselves, and facing quarantine and closures at their campuses, and also balancing their own studies at the same time. Yeah, so it's very impressive for me. So on that note, we'd like to thank all of you and look forward to seeing you again in our next rendition. Thank you.